This panel that you're seeing up here is for the purpose of seeding a conversation for possibility and immediate action in the coming days and the months to unlock transition. These folks that you see on the stage here are experts who have demonstrated their capacity in integrating capacity building into climate finance and ultimately action, which is what this conversation is about. I'd like to introduce our panel, and I'm starting all the way at the end there with Victor Kitanga. Victor is an economist with 20 years of experience in advising governments on economic policies and fiscal contractual matters relating to oil, gas, and mining investment. Advisor on oil, gas, and mining fiscal policy reforms and fiscal modeling for the Commonwealth Secretariat in London. He is currently a technical assistant advisor in the Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund, providing tax policy advice on oil, gas, and mining fiscal regime implementation. Welcome, Victor.
Thank you, Bill. As Bill mentions, today it's all about innovations, it's all about new ideas.
Victor, let me just pause you for just a second there. Let me introduce the rest of the panel, and then I'm going to start with you and come back with a question for you that I'm very interested in hearing your perspective on. So let me introduce the rest of the panel, and we'll go from there. Is that all right? Okay, great. Next, we have Chong Diwal, next to Victor. Chong, with over 18 years of experience in the energy sector, Chong is a passionate, extensive expertise and knowledge in hydrogen production, transportation, and end use, as well as industry and consumers to make energy lower carbon, safer, and more efficient, as well as to attract, develop, and equip the diverse future energy workforce. He's also contributed to decision-making through convening expertise and influencing and informing energy decision-making through convening expertise and advice and influencing policy and regulation. He's committed to advancing innovation, collaboration, and transformation in the energy sector and empowering the next generation. Impressive, everybody so far. Jans Jaeger. Welcome, Jans, in the middle here. Jans leads the policy and business development team of the Alliance for Rural Electrification, the ARE, a global business association representing more than 200 members in the decentralized renewable energy industry in emerging markets. His work is focused on business and market development, policy advocacy, and partnerships. Welcome, Jans. Stan Fielding is our next gentleman here. Stan is a young professional, as young as a young professional at the UK-based Membership Association for Renewable Energy and Clean Technology, working as a policy advisor on reform to organics recycling, notably leading the coordination of finance members, including investors, insurers, and consultants. He'll be contributing his insight to investors' decision-making and the technical constraints and opportunities when finance is directed to renewable energy projects. Welcome, Stan. And finally, Chris Chagwanta. Chris is the Vice President of the International Renewable Energy Systems, Inc., IRIS. He's a professional engineer with 15 years of business development and project management experience in the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. He's a United Nations affiliated technical reviewer, a member of Canada's Sustainable Development Advisory Council, Commonwealth Engineers Council Board, the Commonwealth Sustainable Energy Transition Agenda, World Federation of Engineering Organizations, Climate Action Working Group, the Association of Professional. Where do you find the time? My God. Yeah, exactly. Yes, amazing. And co-president, investigation committee, and the co-president of the YEG Passport Rotary Club. And no wonder we find you running all over the blue zone lately. So it's amazing. Thank you very much. So what I'd like to do is start with Victor. And Victor, what I would really love to hear is, what can you share with us about the Commonwealth Sustainable Energy Transition Agenda and the initiatives? Where are we with those and what's working?
The Communal Sustainable Energy Transition Agenda is a platform which I lead. It's a platform for collaboration. It brings different actors, and through collaborations, we're able to attract financing, different ideas. We have designed toolkits. One of the things that we're focusing on energy transition is, when you think about energy, largest contributor to climate change, around 75%, it creates both challenges and opportunities. One of the things that has acted as a barrier we've found in most developing countries, where most of my work is focused on emerging and developing countries, is there is commitment to transition, in particular small island development states where the government have made 100% commitment to transition by 100%, but money is not at the table. And one of the things we've done is, where investors are asking about, okay, what is the size of the pie? So we have developed a toolkit, which is basically a financial and cost-benefit analysis that sizes up the size of the market. And then we are presenting that business case, a country or sector business case, which essentially provide a bridging, what you call data about investment and financing opportunities overall. So kind of give a big scale to make it more attractive. And this is where we are. And governments are now able to kind of engage with investors. The investors are asking, okay, this is the size of the market, the cake. Where are the projects? And so the idea behind is, organizations that provide grant money are coming forth to help government start to define the specific projects. And this is where the challenge is now, going out and what we call an investment and an investor roundtable to help the government showcase these business cases, to start engaging with individual financiers, DFIs, and the likes. So this is the focus on the power sector, where is the biggest hanging fruit. We have now developed another toolkit for the transportation sector, basically defining decarbonization scope for the transport sector. How much savings, financial savings, can be realized by replacing expensive fossil fuel with cheaper clean energy. And the net benefit of those financial savings are part of the business case. And the question then is, where are the projects? How do we divide the pie, basically?
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there anything you might want to add about what your hope is, what your personal hope is on what the initiatives are going to be able to do, and what you would really like to see happen next with them?
What we expect as the next initiative is where other partners, because this is a collaborative platform, other partners are starting to ask, because other partners do not have this information. They are looking for specific areas where they need to engage with the government to define more of these projects. Some of these are early stage, so they need feasibility study financing. Others are at more advanced stage, where you have developers, but they are looking for some government funding. One of the DFIs wanted to kind of go through the government with soft loans that can be on-lent to a developer, but via a government vehicle. So this is where the next steps are, basically.
Very good.
Marketing those countries. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Victor. I appreciate that. And I just want, we're going to have about hopefully 10 minutes at the end for questions. So while you're listening here, and if a question comes up for you, be prepared to ask that to any of the panel members. And the same for the panel members. If you've heard something that sounds like, I have a follow-up question for that, let's be sure and ask it. Thank you, Victor. So Chinan, let's go to you. Does everybody have a microphone, by the way? Oh, yeah. Excellent. Ready to go. Chinan, what can you share with us about the renewable energy deployment in Africa? And what insights can you share about what works and what more is needed now? It's probably a laundry list of things. That's a big question, but what would you say to that?
Thanks, Billy. So I was going to say before we think about Africa, I think there's also a place to just consider what's happening on the globe. So for the first time in 2022, investments into solar energy alone was greater than investments into oil globally. So that's a massive tipping point. This never happened before. You go back
Wow.
5-10 years ago, investment into upstream oil and gas was probably, 18, probably the order of 8, 9, 10 times what comes into solar or renewable energy. So there's a massive shift. But to your question around Africa, I think what's happening in Africa is not any different. For the first time, we're starting to see new capital that's going into huge solar projects, most of them off-grid. So yes, there are solar investments that are going into, sort of rooftop solar, 1 kilowatt, 3 kilowatt for houses. But I think the big shifts we're seeing are in the range of 10 kilowatt, 50 kilowatt municipal type projects. And there are several of those happening all across Africa. In Nigeria, I think just this year we've seen probably 50 in feasibility studies alone. We've just delivered one, northern part of Nigeria. You go to South Africa, several. You go to Angola. I mean, all across the place, there are huge amounts of projects that are coming up. And I think a lot of them are targeting that gap. You think about Africa, 1.3 billion people, 600 million of those energy poor without, any access to electricity. So the quick thing that's happening is many investors are tapping into that and trying to close that gap, providing energy in a very quick way.
Can I just confirm what I think I heard there? Did you just say that more investment in solar in Africa than in oil and gas? Is that what you said?
No, globally.
In
Correct.
Africa, globally?
No.
Oh, globally, then say it again for me.
Yeah, so globally, we've seen more capital flow into solar energy development than into upstream oil and gas.
Wow.
For the first time ever.
A show of hands, does that surprise you? Who's surprised by that? Yeah, lots of people are surprised by. I'm surprised by that. So, fantastic. That's an incredible
and
amount.
I think just to caveat, so
Yeah.
why that's happening, I mean, it's not surprising, right? You go to any of the investment houses today, ESG is a big thing. Many projects have to go through huge hurdles before they get sanctioned. You take Africa, for the sake of argument, in the last 10 years, year on year in Africa, it was about 50 billion of capital coming into upstream projects. Today in Africa, I think you'd be very shocked if you get 20. So most of the large deep water developments have all gone off. I mean, many of us know that. Lots of the deep water projects do not exist anymore.
Wow. So that's super inspiring, and I'm thrilled to hear that. And yet, what's needed now that if you could wave a wand and say, boy, if we could get this, and what's really needed now is to unblock that, what would you say?
I'd say so there are a couple of things that are important to accelerate it in Africa. One of those is what's happening in Europe already. So many of you know, so in Q4 2023, there's what we call Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. New legislation just come off in Europe. That's just taken hold. And what that means is if you're accessing European markets, you'd start to pay a carbon tax. So there's a carbon tax from about 2026 if your product hits into Europe. Now, if you do the same for Africa or come up with some sort of a carbon trading scheme in Africa, then what you'd find is a lot of the hugely polluting industries. You go to South Africa, huge coal reserves. It's probably, I think, per capita in the world, South Africa is, in terms of coal, one of the biggest polluters there. So if you have a carbon trading scheme or legislation in that regard, you could phase that out quite quickly.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So let's go to Jans. Jans, from a policy standpoint, what are you already learning about what works and what doesn't, specifically regarding rural electrification? If you had to start all over, what would you do newly or differently to ensure a smoother and more effective and efficient implementation?
Yeah. No.
On-off button.
Well, anyway, thank you for the question. So in terms of policies, I think the overarching conclusion is you need very solid electrification plans on the top level from government side. So the historical examples, US, China, and most recently India have very successful electrification stories. In the US, actually, electrification was done through public-private partnerships. It was based also on the idea of rural cooperatives in agricultural areas, so using electricity for agriculture. So I think that's a valuable lesson learned on the policy side. You need coordinated government action in collaboration with private sector. Successful examples currently, so my neighbor mentioned Nigeria. That's a great example of electrification done right at the moment. The government of Nigeria, led by the Rural Electrification Agency and the Ministry of Power, is coordinating rural electrification in a very efficient way with private sector mini-grids, so systems that are 10 to 50 kilowatt peak, maybe a little bit larger than that. In other countries as well, in Africa, that's happening. Senegal is another example of where you have large-scale mini-grid deployment. So those are success cases, and the lesson learned is you need an entity in the government that is coordinating this and having it as a political priority. So that's the top level. Then when you go further down, you can look at all the nitty-gritty of mini-grid policies, grid integration, and so on. But that's really the bottom line. And then, of course, coordinating this with private sector early on so that you have the buy-in and that the projects are structured in a way that private sector can co-invest. In terms of that, so that's the macro level. On the micro level, I think an interesting learning we have as well is that obviously people matter as well. So it's important that we have that there are skilled people within the government, within these entities that can really carry the torch here and promote this internally, implement this action in practice. So I think one learning here is, in the past we conducted a lot of trainings for government, but they were maybe one-offs. They were not institutionalized, to use a word. Mm-hmm. So the important thing here is you need to embed these skills in the governments. You need to embed, well, first of all, that there's a political priority. That's the macro level. But on the micro level, you need to have people that are knowledgeable and skilled on the topic.
Very good. Excellent. And I'm curious, so you've talked about the learnings. Perfect. What frustrates you right now that you would just, what is really frustrating you around policy that you think is really inhibiting the ability to get stuff done?
That's a good question. I think if I look at specific country examples, so some countries have either the micro level that works or the macro level, but you don't have both. I don't really want to name the bad examples here, but there are certain countries, for example, in Asia, where on paper it looks very good. You have all the right policies, but it's not happening. Why is that? It's perhaps because the people sitting in the key positions don't know this topic well enough, or they come from a background where they don't have knowledge about renewables or distributed renewables. So I think maybe adding to the point I made earlier about solid electrification planning, part of that, of course, part of all new connections come from grid, but a large part also comes from distributed renewables, microgrids, standalone systems. And so that's a whole area of expertise as well, off-grid solutions, distributed renewables. And so often that skill is not necessarily there. So that frustrates me, the micro level lack of capacity sometimes. And that's something we're trying to bridge also through partnerships. For example, we recently signed one yesterday with the Commonwealth, so focusing on public-private partnerships.
Okay. Thank you, and I'm hoping that some of you are thinking of questions that you could ask that would further explore and expose maybe some opportunities to unleash some things. So let's go to Stan. Stan, similar question from a policy standpoint, since that's your area. What are you already learning about what works and what doesn't? Maybe what's the same about what Jan said, but maybe what's different? And this one regarding developed countries such as the EU and the UK. And similarly, if you could start over, what would you do newly or differently to ensure smoother, more effective, and efficient implementation?
Great, thanks for that, Billy. So I think the starting point that I'd go with is when we're looking at the flows of investment and the flows of finance, what matters most for those people, for those investors making those choices, is the risks involved with every single decision that they make. As far as those risks within the UK, I think the most important steps that we've taken to be able to unlock investment, to be able to increase the deployment, has been related to government-related schemes. So like Jan said, it's really when government decides to take a path, to take a step forward, to advance technology, that's where private finance comes in and really is the enabler there. So I think the thing that I'd point to first would be the contracts for difference schemes in the UK, which really is what enabled us to get from almost no offshore wind generation to that being 50% of our renewable generation, which we're now 43% decarbonised as far as electricity generation in the UK. And so it's really a scheme that gives the investors the confidence about how much they will earn on every megawatt that they produce. So it's steps that we can take that decrease that risk, that unlock the finance. I think that's what we're not seeing enough of now is, as the Association for Renewable Energy and Clean Technology, we represent almost every renewable energy technology in the UK. And offshore wind, fantastic, we're sorted, we're advancing. There is a firm business case that we don't need support schemes to be able to hold now. We've gone along that path. However, the next steps in decarbonising are the other technologies. It's heat pumps in households, it's longer duration energy storage. There's all these other technologies that don't have quite that business case yet to be able to stand on their own two legs. And what's needed to advance them is, again, confidence from government. Saying that this is the path that we want to take, and providing the subsidy schemes, providing the essentially de-risking the choices that investors would make.
Very good, thank you. I'm going to come back to you other guys. I want to know what you're frustrated about around policy, but we're going to let Chris talk, and then just see that question, because Chin and I could see you want to answer that question. Okay, great. So Chris, from an implementation and a design and implementation perspective, what do you see is important to address in the design and execution of these initiatives to enable funds to flow more freely and to achieve a quicker maturation? How are we going to get this money to the people who need it in the way that they need it in the most efficient, effective way? What needs to change about that? We've got some slides here. Great.
Thanks, Billy. I think a lot of the things that Chinan talked about, Jens, and here Stan have talked about are things that I think are really important. Basically, I'm going to start off from the macro side, talk about a bit about the risk, talk about the need to focus on people, and then I'll come down to the micro, which is Jens' frustration, and I completely agree. So if you look at the upstream side, which is where the thinking happens, the first thing that I think is the biggest frustration, especially on the micro level, it's the needs assessment. Like, what do the people really want? And when we're looking at it from a lens of not just putting in electrification plans, but looking at development plans beyond just electrification. And when we're doing that, we're looking at it from a lens of, say, for instance, just transition. What are the needs of the people? What are the things that they are currently dealing with? What is their lived experience at this time? And what is that going to look like in a few years' time? And while thinking about that, we're co-creating, the right kinds of policy and also pulling that into regulation, which now empowers them to deliver a bit more, get a bit more clarity around the kind of investments that could come. But in doing all of that, developer, come put this solution in, or they go meet a wind turbine developer and say, hey, come put a wind resource, which is great, but the problem is you leave a lot of opportunities on the table and you're not able to deliver a lot more value from a developmental standpoint. So I'll just jump this slide. I'll give an example of a project that I was involved in. So there was this county, very unlikely situation here, a county that is a legacy oil and gas producer. They were producing oil and gas, or they've been producing oil and gas for at least the last 80 years. So they had quite a lot of pipelines that were no longer in use, buried underneath the ground and all of that. And then they said, okay, the county, he asked for a bit of help to understand how best to expand the needs analysis so that it is focused on his county and not just picking up a solution that someone else is installing or wind resource, did all of the calculations, and he found out that a combination of solar and wind is fantastic. He has a 30% benefit that you have. When you're compressing air into the pipeline, what happens is you generate heat. Now that heat is being used for greenhouses because half the year it's a bit too cold to farm. So they're using greenhouses in their homes, chemicals for manufacturing, food and beverage from that system. And then downstream, when you decompress air, you get cooling. So they're using that cooling for data centers. They're using the cooling for ice production, manufacturing, and different kinds of systems. So you see a fully integrated system that looks not just at electrification, but developmental solution that benefits the society, not just immediately, but in the long term.
Wow, what a great example. That is a great example of when it really, really works. So I want to follow back with Chinan. You were getting animated there when we were talking about the frustration. So I would love to get your next question and anything else you want to add to what you've heard so far.
No, I was going to pose a question to Stan because he spoke about contract for difference, which I think is incredibly powerful for the UK. In Africa, I mean, we talk to lots of governments around some of these developments, but the hat they wear is that of a subsidy. So I just want to understand, how does that compare? What have you found that's really worked in terms of CFDs compared to subsidies?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I think what's important about the CFDs is the fact that it's what you can see with CFDs, the most important bit has been over the last 2 years where electricity prices have absolutely spiked. So what CFDs did in the short term, let's say from 2010 to 2019, is it gave developers the confidence that they would get a certain level of income, and that scaled down over time. So it meant that as the technologies improved, as prices for the generation decreased, that was reflected in the prices that ultimately consumers paid, and so that was fantastic. On the other side, now that electricity prices in the market have risen massively over the last 2 years, it still continues to protect those consumers. So because, let's say, SSE were selling, let's say just say a wind generator was selling electricity to the market at a much higher price than what the CFD level was fixed at, it means that they were paying that money back to the government, which ultimately went back to decrease consumers' bills. So it's not a subsidy because it's not always one direction. It's not money flowing from consumers to the generators. It actually is just about that de-risking aspect. And I would say the only places where there's a cost is where the level of that CFD is incorrectly fixed, essentially, where there's a problem of information.
What other questions do you guys have based so far? Yeah, Jans, definitely.
I have a question to my colleague here on the left as well. You were mentioning carbon taxes, or, well, if you want to turn it on a positive, carbon markets. So we've also discussed this a bit in ARE, but we haven't really found a standpoint on how we can action that. So what are we going to do about it? Okay, it's an opportunity, then what? So my question to you is, okay, what's needed to catalyze this market in your opinion?
So I think if you think about how the carbon markets work today, so if you're a petrochemical producer in Europe, a refinery or anything like that, you have an allowance. So they give you, I think, over the last couple of years, they'll give you a huge allowance of how much CO2 you can put out. If you emit above that, then you pay a penalty equivalent to the price of the ETS, of the emissions trading scheme, currently about 95 euros per ton, something like that. So what we've found is that sort of incentive has pushed many companies to think very carefully about energy efficiency projects. I mean, Stan was mentioning heat pumps. So heat pumps being massive for houses right now. You know, many people are really rationalizing their energy consumption and thinking very cleverly around how they would decrease that. Same for industry. If you don't want to pay that penalty, then you'd have to start to put programs in place for energy efficiency. And we are starting to see that. I mean, there was something in the news this year about Europe having reduced its overall energy efficiency by energy consumption by 15%. So since the war started, Russia and Ukraine, 15% decrease in total energy consumption, which I think is very significant. And much of that comes from energy, energy efficiency. Sorry, I'm not sure I answered your question, but...
I think indirectly, yes. So basically what you're saying is we need to tax industries that consume a lot of, or use a lot of emit a lot. And then with that, we can create a market for this as well. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Victor, I was going to say you have a very inquisitive look, and I'm wondering, what are you hearing that sounds fresh to you, that sounds like new possibility? What are you hearing, and what can you add here?
I think for me it's more from Jens about the success in Nigeria in terms of being able to kind of accelerate rural electrification. And there's always going to be a question about what is the business model that has worked? Because one of the challenges with rural electrification is the consumers do not have the ability to actually create a profitable market. And what has worked in terms of making sure that there is a business model that allows for that rural electrification investment?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's great because it allows me to deep dive a bit into what I said before. And I think originally, actually, we also had a speaker from SC for All on the panel who is leading the Universal Electricity Facility in Nigeria, among other countries. So what that facility and the general national electrification plan in Nigeria has done is there is a subsidy to developers. So mini-grid developers, for example, they can access a subsidy based on connections and the tier of connection. And so that means that kind of de-risks it for private sector to invest in mini-grid projects. And at the same time, because there's the subsidy, it can bring the tariff down. And mini-grid developers can reach communities that are otherwise not commercially viable to access. So that's a good example of the power of a subsidy, because it can make... So if you didn't have that subsidy, perhaps the mini-grid developer would focus on the nucleus of the USD investment round for mini-grids, which is quite exceptional. Another is Husk Power, also in Nigeria. And so that's based indeed on a bundled approach where you look at multiple mini-grids across a region of the country or several regions, and not the individual project per se, because when you look at an individual 10 kilowatt peak mini-grid, for example, it's quite hard to attract commercial investment because it's small. So DFI, for example, they look at a project that is large, millions. And so now when you get to a portfolio level, 80 million, for example, it's within the scope of what a DFI is
going to be in the next few years. And gradually you see that changing a lot of things with time. And coming to the first question you asked about being able to create a solid value proposition for such projects, how are they able to afford it? I think one of the points that have been made repeatedly at this COP and even before is how to think differently around what the value proposition for projects is beyond just the economic or commercial value to the social value. For instance, you electrify a home today, that home is able to create value for tomorrow in many ways. You electrify a business, a small business today, it's able to create value for others, and then it pumps that back into the economy and you have economic growth for the future. It is way less return, if I put it that way, and way less investment required from international bodies.
And who doesn't love that? Victor, and then we'll come to Stan.
I think mine was quite an interesting angle to it. There are two issues. One, when you think PO's growth system, they operate in Kenya, they operate in some elements in Nigeria. The purely private entrepreneurs who run these networks through aggregation, and through that, they're able to kind of create sufficient market to have a revenue stream to support those investments.
And so I think that reimagining what risks are considered.
Talking about just an equitable technologies, the conversation is just going about financing and financing and financing. People who need them are
for this transition energy. Do you think there is any challenges and opportunities for the microfinance institution, and especially in the African countries as well?
Excellent. Thank you so much.